One thing I particularly don't like to use AI for is stuff like synthetic user research. Sorry, synthetic users. We're no longer thinking through the problem. We're saying this is the solution to the problem because this has always been the solution to the problem. And the AI reinforces that. I wanted to be a psychiatrist for a while. I got to go work with a couple psychiatrists who focused on DID, dissociative identity disorder, and schizophrenia. I started at IBM right out of college. I started as an intern, and then a few months later, they took me on full time. One of the most important classes I took was psych measurements. How do we make sure that a study is well designed? We think about the product so much and how that is the most important thing, and like we're measuring the interaction between the person and the product. But in reality, they're a full like human being. One of the biggest things my psych background has brought to my design practice has been understanding that the product is not the most important thing in that person's life at that moment. Design is always about building a potential future. If we're building a product, we need to imagine what a future where this product exists look like. There's so many assumptions that are made regardless of how much user research you've done. How many of us have silently mourned the death of a loved one while folding socks? What is the effect of having every easy thing done for us?
Brandon, welcome to Product Craft.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Honestly, I'm very excited. I've listened to a few episodes and I really like the way your conversations tend to go. I think it's going to be a good time.
So you're a design and strategy leader, and you're currently at IBM Innovation Studio. Before we dive into all the exciting new things that you're working on, and I know that you're a lot into generative AI and innovation in general, you seem to work at the intersection of design, technology, and strategy. Who do you identify with like the most as far as your role, or who do you aspire to be?
You know, it's really interesting. I've kind of been asking myself this question for a really long time because there are really just so many like interesting people to pull inspiration from. I think earlier on in my career, I was like, ooh, I want to be like Aaron Drapp. I want to be that cool guy doing like cool designs, being like all-American kind of punk. And then I got into Mike Montero and Erica Hall. I really like their passion about being just people and like understanding the relationship between people in business and the ethics around that.
Did you originally get into the field as a designer, or did you get into the field through something else?
So I was a psychology major, and this was a whole big journey through college where I wanted to be a psychiatrist for a while, but I was also kind of considering going into computer science, mostly because I just thought computers were kind of cool. I found that psychiatry was a bit heavy for me at the time. I knew it was going to involve like going to medical school, and I wasn't sure about like the therapeutic of like how if being a therapist, especially one that like also works through prescribing medicine, was the direction I wanted to go in my career. And then I just kind of came across UX, and I decided to stay a psychology major because there weren't too many UX related degrees around at the time. I was probably just a couple years before that really came onto the academic scene.
What prompted you to want to become a psychiatrist? Do you have some family who's working in the field, or was it just an interest?
It's always just been an interest of mine. I think like I grew up and I have ADHD. I've had a lot of just interest in like neurodivergence in general throughout my whole life. I think when I wanted to be a psychiatrist, I actually did a small internship in high school. It was through a mentorship program where I got to work with a couple psychiatrists who focused on DID, dissociative identity disorder, and schizophrenia. And I, being the high schooler I was just like, oh, this is just like interesting and kind of like edgy to work in. I was also like very artistic and creative as a kid. I used to want to be a filmmaker too, and I would make films, and a lot of like the scripts that I would write for film classes kind of revolved around mental disorders. And it was a little cringy. And then when I started to really think about like the reality of it and whether it was really what I wanted to do, I wasn't fully in it. I think the research, especially like because I went to community college, The research aspect of it seemed a little daunting. There were a few professors there that did research around like the psychology of happiness, which I thought was really interesting. One day kind of came across the field of user experience, and I was in, because at the time I was like, oh, maybe I'll go into like video game design, or like I want to do something kind of creative. I used to draw. I used to like, I thought about going into graphic design for a while, but I had a lot of pressure around, I need a job that like pays kind of well. Uh,
Yeah.
and graphic design did not have a very strong reputation for making tons of money.
Yeah.
And
Have you seen the movie by Stefan Zagmeister on happiness?
I don't know if I have.
You have to check it out if you haven't. Do
Yeah.
you know who Stefan Zagmeister is?
No.
Oh, yeah, that's going to be your new favorite
Yeah.
designer. Yeah, he's an amazing designer. He's a graphic designer, like yeah, very famous. And he did this movie, yeah, like literally on happiness. He's been exploring what it means. It's a fun one.
Very
You just
cool.
yeah, you mentioned films and happiness, so I think it's a good reference. Essentially, it sounds like so. Yeah, you were interested in psychiatry, then UX, and then through UX, then you kind of started to explore design, and this is where you started learning about prominent designers and their philosophies. Am
Mhm.
I getting that right?
Yeah, I was really lucky one year to be able to go. I got a scholarship to go to a conference in Pittsburgh where a bunch of designers and tech folk. It was kind of like a multidisciplinary conference. I actually saw Mike Montero speak there for the first time, and I saw the inventor of GNU speak there,
Hmm.
and um, and a few other like really interesting people. And I started looking into the local community around tech in Dallas, or in UX in Dallas as well. Because I was a psychology major, a lot of what I tried to do was focus my studies around the more what could be applied to UX. So a lot of like cognition. Wherever I could, I would find like avenues to human computer interaction, and lots of like qualitative and quantitative analysis type stuff. So, and it's funny too, because a lot of this is kind of like the backing that would make a good UX researcher, but that's not what I wanted to do. I also still wanted that kind of, I just like to make things. I kind of
Hmm.
like collect a lot of hobbies. I play guitar. I like paint. I've done photography since I was in like middle school. I did filmmaking for a while. Um, so that like aspect of like creation was really just like a big puller for me toward user experience. And the psychology aspect of it was one, I was just interested in the field. I have always like, I had that ground zero level interest in psychology, where I've always like, regardless of whether it was in abnormal psychology or cognitive or behavioral or whatever, it was all, I was really interested in how people interact with like the world and other people. And so so sociology was a big interest of mine as well. Um,
Hmm.
but I also was like, I don't want to go into clinical. If anything, if I did stay in psychology, I would have stayed in experimental. And um, I think a lot of what I did in my first few years out of college, which I started at IBM right out of college. I started as an intern, and then a few months later, they took me on full time. And a lot of what I tried to do was see about how I could apply what I was doing in my psychology degree to user experience, kind of in a way of like studying the general mental models of people and how they interact with technology.
Yeah, I was going to
Oh,
ask about
yeah.
that. It's a common notion for user experience designers to kind of say that, well, it's important to understand people's psychology, et cetera, et cetera. But how would you say it actually translates? Like how does that experience helped you perhaps, or maybe didn't?
Yeah. Honestly, I think what really, really helps, and in more of a passive way than in a practical way, is building this kind of like general idea of how to build constructs around human psychology. Um, so when, like, for example, like when we talk about memory, there are like different categories of memory. There's implicit and explicit. There's long-term memory, short-term memory, and then when we get into, and a lot of this is like specific stuff I learned a long time ago. So like the actual specific concepts around psychology are like very fuzzy now. But I think like being able to generally understand how to build mental models and generally understand like typical human patterns as people like do things in general. Now, obviously, like people are unique, and even in psychology, like I think one of the like most important classes I took was uh, psych measurements. So how do we study validity um, or accuracy in psychological experiments, and how do we measure for the level of error or so like p-value or like how do we make sure that a study is well designed? And when you sort of get this training, you get this implicit understanding of how to like gather information around how people interact with the world and other people and things.
Being able to measure things, kind of the approach to measure things.
Yeah. I think what's helped me a lot in my psychology background is the ability to like really it's almost like this like intuitive form of empathy. I think like being able to see how people do things in their day to day and really get this kind of, I don't want to say intuitive understanding of like emotion, but learning how to talk to people and not only just like hear the words that they're saying, but like intuit why they might be saying it, or I don't know. It's a really
Like
vague.
reading between the lines,
Yeah,
potentially.
yeah. It's a
It's
really
it's
vague
interesting.
type of connection.
It's interesting because like psychology overall, I mean, it's huge, right? Like we are operating kind of in a very niche environment where the person is interacting, with the digital screen, with the machine. Is there kind of a field or particular basics that are actually like relevant? Like you mentioned mental models, which I think it's great to talk about that, but like maybe is there a subset? Like let's say for designers or anyone else watching this, if they wanted to sort of get the most important kind of gist to understand, is there anything to like put in a Google search or OpenAI?
Mm, mm, mm. I think like I don't know if I have anything that practical, but I think like the connection there really is just about like understanding that there are ways to understand people as they are. And so much within user experience, like it's almost like we think about the product so much and how that is like the most important thing, and like we're measuring the interaction between the person and the product, but in reality like they're a full like human being. And I think like one of the biggest things my psych background has brought to my design practice has been understanding that the product is not the most important thing in that person's life at that moment. Now, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
they're in highly intense situations in which, like, if you're designing something that's meant for a doctor, like, yes, they are fully focusing on that. Like, well, and even then, like, they're not really,
Hopefully.
yeah, but even then, they're not really focusing on the product. They're focusing on what the end result of using the product is. They have all of these like different things going on in the back of their mind, or they're in a state where they've been like searching for a house for like the last day or two, and like they're exhausted, or like their loved one just died and they're depressed, and or it's like when we design products, there's so like much ego around it, and we need to understand that there is a full like world of emotion and human just life happening in the background. And I think that is like not a direct.
I think that's really important. Like to me, I think it aligns with kind of, I think the fundamental of what design is in the first place. It's not about you, like as the creator, right? Like this is where the
Yeah.
difference is with art, right? Where through the art, it's kind of your own self-expression. But when we design, it is about meeting the needs of other people. And while we all have egos and you can't get around that, it's kind of this reminder that there is more to it than like your, as you said, like your product is not the main thing. It's a fragment in time. They may be interacting with that for 5 minutes of a day, and maybe you just need to focus on making those 5 minutes be like as easy as possible, but there is the whole it's not the primary focus of their life. um,
Exactly. It's like and it's a difficult balance because you have like the needs of the business as well. Like you are hired by a business to make a good interaction, or you're hired by the business to make a good design. And in order for it to be a good design, it needs to also fulfill the needs of the business itself. And this is I think where you also need to understand that, like, with the product that you're building and the interaction design you have going for it, you are just an interface for the person to, or I guess the product is just the interface for the person to interact with the business at these like high construct levels, right? And the value that the business provides and the needs that the user has are within this like larger context of all of this stuff going on within the user's background and all of this stuff going on within the business's background.
you mentioned mental models, but before even mental models, oftentimes very much assumed that designers create personas and customer journeys and this and that. And like from my personal practice, um, like sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it may not. It really depends.
Yeah, I think I don't make as many personas as like we traditionally view them in UX. And I think a big part of that is because my design process is so informed by like what is going on in the moment when it comes to the person's needs. It's not really about any particular demographic or type of person. I think those are useful tools for the business in that it can bring a bit of focus into, okay, who are the general people we're building a product for? Like if we're building a product for doctors, then obviously like what kind of doctor? Like what are their main practices? And then we can bring a bit of focus to the research side of things. And that I would say is like kind of a proto persona. But when we get into like mental models, that's when we start thinking about like, okay, we have an idea of the general type of people who are using this product or the diversity of people who are using this product. And we can think of, okay, what is happening when a person generally is trying to achieve this goal? And throughout that, what are they thinking and what are they saying? What are they doing? What are they feeling? Um, and I mean, that's a classic like empathy map. I kind of do a lot of empathy maps, and I know those are a little controversial because so much of them can be assumed. But you can also derive those kind of insights from user research or from actually involving your users in the ideation process as well.
Can you
Uh,
describe what empathy map is?
yeah, it's just listing out like within a specific situation, what is a person doing, thinking, feeling, or saying. Say you're working on a product for a doctor who is building a diagnosis of a patient. They are talking to the patient. That's stuff that they're saying. They're thinking about their other patients as well. They are thinking about like how are they, like what are the different symptoms. They're maybe feeling a bit tired. Maybe they're feeling a bit overwhelmed. And they're doing things like writing down notes. They're actively listening. They're passively thinking. They're doing all of these different conscious, subconscious, and I guess expressive actions throughout this like situation in time, right? And it's not really about like the actual persona itself within that situation, especially if we're working on like a product with variable kinds of users. It's more about like what are the things that are happening when people are trying to achieve a goal that our product is trying to help facilitate. Um,
If this is the product experience, right, like the particular chunk, do you also look at what happens before and after? Is that kind of what you're trying to do? Or do you create an empathy map within the context of the product?
so because so much of the work I do is kind of on like product design from the perspective of there is no product yet, or if we are working on a product, like I mean, yes, I'll say yes. Um, when we're building a product, even if there is already one available, it's important to think about what's happening before and after the I guess time frame of usage, as well as what's happening during the time frame. But that's because if you are conceptualizing what a product needs to be, which I mean, design in general, I think is a practice of conception. Um, then you're able to understand all of the variables and nuances around like what are the problems people face when they are trying to achieve a certain goal. Um, what are the gaps in the experience of trying to achieve that goal today? And when we're building our product, how can we fill in those gaps or make those experiences better? And this makes it so it's not necessarily from a product oriented perspective, but a problem oriented perspective. Uh,
What do you mean? Can you double click on design as a process of conception? Like, what do you mean by that?
so, uh, if I can go back to like our conversation around like inspiration a little bit, a big part of like, especially reading this like this book, Design Unbound, but also diving into a bit of like more experimental methods of design. Like you'll see people like Julian Bleecker, who is really popularizing design fiction. And then you'll see people like OIO or Normal's Futures in Europe. And these are studios that are focused on like design futures or future forecasting, or there's a ton of different names for it right now, but it's this practice of like building a potential future based on the signals of what are happening today, and then conceptualizing around what a product or what are the implications of that future in regards to today. So with design fiction specifically as a practice is building a boring object that resides in some kind of future. And what it does is it provides a means for us uh, to intuit what that future might look like, given
Hmm.
the implications or what is implied by this object existing. It's kind of like a reverse anthropology or a reverse archaeology. Like you're taking an artifact from the future and studying it. Now that's kind of a bit of an aside. So when we go into like design as a practice of conceptualization, when you really think about it, at the end of the day, design is always about building a potential future. If we're building a product, if we're building something that needs to exist, that means it doesn't exist yet. So we need to imagine what a future where this product exists
Hmm.
looks like. And then we need to actually go through and build it. There's so many like assumptions that are made throughout the design process, regardless of how much like user research you've done.
That's really cool. I'm glad I asked because so my personal favorite definition of design was actually I heard it for the first time from my friend and former colleague Yuri, and so it goes like this: is that design is the process of transforming the current state of reality into desired state of reality, which is uh, kind of similar to what you're describing, looking into the future, comparing it with the current state, and essentially paving the path, connecting the dots between the current and desired state.
Right. I think like Erica Hall, I was lucky enough to be able to take a workshop by her a few months back, and um, she defined like she defined a business as just the process of making bets on human behavior, and I think that's like very much in line with what design is and what this kind of like idealization of design as a practice of like conceptualizing futures looks like. Is making bets based on our understanding of what the future could look like, and then actually like building intent out of those bets and then bringing form to that intent.
Let's. I want to talk a little bit about the mental models because I think it's
Yeah,
a great
yeah.
topic. And are there kind of standard categories, if you will, of mental models? Like what goes in, or is it usually defined based on the particular project that you're working on? Like in other words, like is there kind of a template that you kind of fill out, or you think about it in the context of every specific initiative?
Yeah. So generally I like Indy Young's approach to mental models, where it's kind of like mapping out the different beats of a process or an experience, and just making notes about like what is going on at each of those moments or those beats. Um, and these are kind of like stacked. So it's like the person is doing this, or kind of similar to the empathy mapping. They're thinking this or saying this or whatever. And then on the low end of it, is these are the relations to the experience or the mental model of what's going on to our product. And these are like where our product can fit into this larger experience. Now, on the other end of that is, I think there are different kinds of mental models. So if I'm designing, say, an AI experience, the way I usually go, like the process I usually go through, especially like when it comes to generative AI, because there is a limitation to what generative AI can do, is one, frame the problem, and this can be through empathy mapping, process mapping, and then honing in on what are the problems we identify and what are the opportunities we see based on this like observation of what's going on in the present, and then diving into what does an ideal future state for our user look like, given the problems and opportunities that we want to hone in on, and what are the capabilities and what is our intention behind using generative AI in the first place. So this could be like, generative AI is obviously good at generating data. It's good at, it can mimic aesthetics. It can it has like a limited set of things. And I have a whole list of those derived from that when I worked with IBM Research, we were able to derive a lot of like those kind of high level intentions behind why we would want to use AI. And then you have like the actual specific tasks generative AI can perform. And this is where we might get into like more agentive AI. And this is kind of where the mental model comes in. Say you have a problem being solved by a generative AI system, and the specific tasks it's performing are generating a list of generating a list of recommendations. It's extracting data from a data set and classifying it into into particular categories, and then it's clustering those categories or those extracted data set pieces of data into a backing, I guess, kind of context box of information that it uses to generate its recommendation from. So now you have a couple of variables around how the AI is working in the back end and how it's working with the larger system. This is where we get into the mental model of the user. We then say, okay, these are all of the things generative AI is doing. Let's consider, again, the problem, the ideal future state, and like the things AI is doing. And what is the user asking of the system? What are they expecting of it? What are they providing it? Like, what information are they giving it? So this is where like contextual input comes in, or like information intentionally being provided or passively being provided by the user. And so by collecting these different kinds of variables around the human experience as it relates to the AI and to the larger system we're building, we build this mental model of the user throughout this like particular interaction. And we're able to map these actions and these thoughts and these patterns of behavior to the specific actions the system is performing and what that exchange of information looks like.
What does it inform? What does it help to inform the mental model?
It helps inform the larger design of the system by helping us better understand the actual behaviors and actions and the nuggets of data and information that is revolving around a particular context. So
if we looked at kind of practical things, like would it help to figure out, I don't know, the workflow of a particular, I don't know, widget, or how to call something, or how to put a label, but like how does it translate to all of it?
Yeah, it's kind of meant to say, okay, these are the specific things the AI system can do. These are the specific things the person is expecting of and asking of the system. Now this provides like the groundwork to then say, okay, now how are we articulating this exchange of information, or how are we facilitating it through the interface? And then, I mean, we could even get into like the deeper, like iterative design process where it's like, okay, this actually opens up some risk. This opens up some liability to the company. It gives us some insight into, there may be a risk of like data injection or reliance on the model because of this exchange of information and how the mental model of the person using the AI is at work. So it
do you
provides
do
this.
Oh, sorry. Go,
No, no, that's fine.
I was gonna do you do the mental model then in a context with the product capabilities, so you sort of have in the same document would contain both, or like what format is of the mental model? Like, is it usually, I don't know, a matrix, a table, or do you merge things together and show like this is the user, this is the machine?
It's kind of just at the beginning, it's just a list of variables. And then when you start mapping it, it starts to look more like a network map.
Hmm.
And really what it does, and I think it can take like multiple shapes at the end of the day. In the past, it has looked like a matrix. In the past, it has just looked like a bunch of sticky notes on a wall. And
Hmm.
I guess this is almost kind of where like the replacement of a persona comes in. It's not really about like the particular person we're designing for, but what are the behaviors surrounding an interaction. Uh,
It's interesting. I thought just maybe you already played with it. Have you tried to sort of load those parameters of a mental model like into AI and then sort of use those parameters to run, I don't know, ideas or kind of almost like what would this type of a user, what would this type of a person expect in this particular scenario?
yeah,
Or is it usually more of a reference? Because I guess I'm thinking from perspective of like if you have a large document with a bunch of data points, like how do you sort of work with it and how do you absorb that?
yeah. I mean, there's a ton of opportunity to use AI here. I think there's a lot of ways to use it wrong too. Um, and I think one point I want to hone in on about what you mentioned there was like asking an AI what would a person do in this context. And we're getting into like how AI generates things, but it's one thing I particularly don't like to use AI for is stuff like um, synthetic user research.
Mm.
I don't think it's good for that. And sorry, synthetic users, but
Why not?
um, so when we think about like how, particularly like let's just focus on LLMs right now, but this kind of applies to any kind of data model, generative data model. Um, the way it generally works is understanding the different tokens and how they relate to each other, but within contexts to an extent. But what it does is, depending on like um, the level of variability you allow it to generate new tokens within, it either makes something that is very aesthetically similar to the data it's trained on, or it makes something that's less aesthetically similar,
Hmm.
by bringing in like randomization components or randomization. And I'm sure there are going to be some like generative AI researchers who are going to hear how I'm talking about this, and they'll be like, "This guy doesn't know anything." Um, and they're right to an extent. I don't know a lot of the math behind it, so I'll be clear about that. But if so, really, what it comes down to is generative AI generates the aesthetic of what a kind of data would look like. So if you're having it generate a poem, it may look a lot like a poem, but it is just math, building token after token based off the information that's come before it. The way I like to explain this in creative contexts is when we think about, this is just an example like ripped from an article I wrote recently. Um, when we look at a painting like Picasso's Guernica, you see all of the different specific brushstrokes that Picasso like chose to make or chose to leave on the canvas. You have the different elements like the horse, like the woman, like the knife, like the light bulb. You have all of these very specific choices made by Picasso over time through an intentional understanding of, or maybe even unintentional, maybe like more intuitive understanding of the context in which he was building the painting within. Now, when we ask a generative AI model like Midjourney to generate something that is like the horrors of war in the style of Picasso, you get things like you get generated images like skulls and soldiers in uniform and horses. And a lot of this is because when we think about the data is trained on, in a lot of this will be in like a cubist style. And it's because when we think about the data that AI is trained on, it associates Picasso with Cuba style and horses. When it comes to war, it relates soldiers to war and uniforms and skulls to horror. And you'll also get a bit of like an aesthetic sense of like more horror oriented artists as well, especially around like color palettes. So it's not thinking about the background of what war and what horror means, or what the human experience of going through war or anything like that is. It's just generalizing these aesthetic components of the prompt it was given. And it's the same thing with LLMs. So when you say provide an account of, or give recommendations on how people might act in this particular situation, there's going to be some accuracy to it because there are generalized human behaviors. And also, I mean, getting back to mental models in general, and in De Young, when at the end of the day, it's just the aesthetic of what a user response or what a user writing down their thoughts or emotions might look like. It's not what an actual human with all of their background understanding and context and emotion and history in making intentional choices about how they articulate or misarticulate their ideas goes. And in De Young, there's a quote I like from her that goes that like ChatGPT doesn't communicate meaning, we infer meaning from it. So when we use AI systems as a replacement for human interaction and user research and trying to gather information around how humans act, it generates things that look like it, but it's not generating something that derives from actual human lived experience. And so when it comes to those more generalizable things, I think it can be like fine, especially as a means to get a high level understanding of what you could dive more into with actual user interviews or like talking to people in general. But it doesn't provide a good foundation for making decisions around the design of your product.
It's funny, just kind of as a side thought that I had is that, a lot of people who are not familiar with what designers, product designers, user experience designers do, often thinks of the work as, choosing the colors of buttons and placing them on the screen. And it's like, I wish more people understood the depth that that we actually, go to, at least some of us.
I do too. I also don't want to like discount the like level of skill that goes into knowing what color a button should be, though.
I think there's definitely a lot of skill, but there is also so much more than aesthetic surface level. So kind of another thing I was curious about. So let's say you're creating a mental model, and it is in the context of a particular persona, right? User type, whatever. When you have multiple personas, and that those personas are different. I mean, some things among them may be similar, but then some things are different, and sometimes they're drastically different. At the same time, you have a single product. Like, I always like to think about, like, at the end of the day, there is, the product is what it is, and it's going to be that for essentially all of the people, all of the users, unless you make deliberate decisions to kind of customize and personalize experiences. I guess I'm curious, like, because that's something that I'm thinking often about is sort of finding that common ground to deliver the same experience for everybody, or at some point starting to create personalization of experiences. And I don't know if you played with that and what your thoughts are.
I think this is a really interesting topic, and I actually think it's a big like reason to use mental models as a basis for your design, as opposed to personas. And this is where personas can come in and be useful for informing mental models. We say, okay, these are the people we want to solve problems for. Let's understand how they work within this context we're designing a product around. And then we can take the mental model itself And because it's focused more on behavior and thought rather than the actual personas, what we do is we can put like nuggets of data from multiple personas into a single mental model. And if they, whether they are very different or not, that helps us gain an understanding, regardless of our feeling around like which particular users we're building the solution for. We understand these are the components of human behavior we're solving for. And there may be very different components within a particular like nugget of time within that experience, but that gives us a basis for saying, okay, at this point in time, these two very different experiences are happening, and our product sits within this context surrounding it. What design decisions can we make in order to meet both of these different these two different experiences?
Mm-hmm.
And that helps you ideate different like ways of articulating what your interaction design could look like, because maybe there is a single interaction that helps both of those helps improve both of those experiences, or maybe it does mean you need to create two different pathways if we're thinking about like progressive user experiences and or like page
So
oriented.
essentially, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but essentially you're saying that you have kind of mental models specific to the user types relevant to particular personas, but then you start to take out components of behavior, right, as you call them, or particular fragments of that, and essentially construct something that is now used for the definition of the product. So it's kind of like, so you have the right mental models, and then you crystallize that into essentially another, like filter rather, into another document that then starts to map to the product itself.
Yeah. In one way I might see this is like, one way we might be able to like bring form to this is like, I've I've been looking for a new apartment lately, so I feel like I've had good insight into the problems around searching for apartments. But
Mm-hmm.
let's consider the fact that like when you are searching for an apartment, there are different like priorities you have. This could be around the price of your new home per month, and another one could be around the location. Um, these are two different experiences, and like one may be more important to one person than it would be to another. But but they are both present in the process of searching for a new apartment, right? Now, the way apartment search apps like solve for both of these is by providing it within a single interface, like a walk score and like and showing what the price of the apartment is, and being able to filter through those prices. And so it's by understanding like these are the things people care about at this part of the process of the experience, or like depending on what their end goal is, which is to find an apartment. It helps you understand, okay, this is what the actual interface or the product needs to facilitate, and these are the different components of what needs to be facilitated. So it could either be different single like interaction components within a single experience, or it could be like more like it could be filter based, or it could be you look for an apartment location on one page, and then on the next page you like filter it down by price. It's taking like the different things people care about within as they try to reach a goal, and seeing what you can do with your interface in order to facilitate
Yeah.
reaching that goal, regardless of these different priorities between different
Um,
people or between the same person.
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't know how much you encountered this, and if not, it would be maybe hard to answer. But if yes, then I'm curious on your take. Is um, when you find that there are differences in user needs, customer needs, and kind of you can see that there's this user group and they're fairly distinct from this other user group, almost to the point that I mean they have specific needs and workflows that they need to do, like the workflow that this group needs is not applicable to another, right? Um, when you encounter those things, do you try to still resolve them within the context of a singular product? Or do you say, you know what, maybe we need to create a different tool that is just, maybe we kind of branch the product into two?
I think I don't think there's a typical answer to that. I think it's kind of like an either or, but what it does help you understand is there a single component we can build that, even though these are two very different experiential point of views, is there a single experience we can that addresses both of them? What are the overlapping variables between these two very different uh, experiential components? And if there are very, very like few overlapping aspects to it, then maybe that's when you consider prioritizing one or over the other, or building a separate experience for one than you would.
Yeah. And what are the compromises, right? Like, kind of sometimes if you're trying to go like the middle path, there
Mhm.
could be the compromises that mm, may be fine
Yeah.
or maybe not so fine.
So much of
Um,
design is basically saying no to certain choices and saying yes to other choices. And a lot of that depends on like, what are your priorities around the product that you're building?
yeah. Have you encountered any issues in terms of support from engineering to actually build out more personalized custom experiences within a single product?
But yeah, always. I think that's also a component of design. And it's why when we I think it's also why, kind of going back to the idea that the design is a game of like conceptualization. You're not just taking into account the needs of the user, but the business as well, and the capabilities and needs of the engineering team count as part of that contextual like understanding of business needs. If they are in a lot of tech debt, or if they are overworked and this is like a low priority for them, either you have a different perspective from that and you say, okay, no, this actually is a really high priority and you need to be able to articulate why, or you need to be able to work with them and say, okay, if that's not what we can do, let's explore other options, or maybe let's put this on the back burner until it becomes an option available. But that is a conversation between the designer, engineering, and whether you have a product manager or if it's you two against like the overall like business people involved in the project as well. Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's not like you, so much of like what being a designer is also understanding like and communicating the needs around the user, and the businesses or the business person's role is to say, okay, yes, this is what we're going to do because the user needs it and it would be good for us, the business.
Yeah. I think it's a good segue to talk about IBM Innovation Studio.
Yeah.
And can you tell a little bit about what it is and how it fits with the rest of the organization?
Yeah. So I helped start up uh the Dallas Innovation Studio. And when I was brought onto the team, it used to be called IBM Client Centers. And I guess just to give a general overview, the purpose of the innovation studios is to act as kind of neutral ground where sellers, tech teams, partners, etc., anybody, any team at IBM, especially those working with clients, can come to the studio and give their clients a good experience around whatever goal they're trying to achieve. Um, so a lot of my role in that is facilitating conversations and running workshops with clients to not only help them understand like what they can do, but understand where they are and where they could be and kind of what those steps in between look like. Um, and it's funny because like I feel like design thinking is kind of getting a bad rep lately. And I mean, in a lot of ways, rightfully so. And it's because like so many people have like sold design thinking as a promise of, oh, we're going to create a full hour within a 1 week sprint, or we're going to create a full product within a single day. But at the end of the day, what the value of design thinking is to like help people communicate and understand each other. Because when we have when we have a particular project or initiative we're embarking on, it starts out as a bunch of individual people working in a team or multiple teams, and they have their own particular perspective or idea around what this project is, right? And so much of the time, those are different perspectives. And it's because different teams have different needs, like we were talking about between the design team and the engineering team and the business and the client. And so by helping like all of these different groups express what they think the problem we're trying to solve is, and then align on this kind of group think, I don't want to say objective truth around it, but this at least shared idea of what it is, that helps break down those communication silos. And then you're able to, as a group, come together and ideate around what does the actual solution to look like.
What does a workshop look like? How long does it take? And what are the stages and what are the outcomes? What kind of exercises do you do?
Yeah, in my day-to-day job, and to be clear, this is separate from a lot of the work I've been doing with IBM Research and the more like creativity focused AI stuff. A lot of the work I do focuses around like 1 to 3 day engagements where I could be running a workshop as long as an hour, or I could be running like a multi-day full like 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. workshop. And it really depends on the context as far as what it looks like. It could just be a simple, like, let's do some quick ideation around like what we might want to move forward on based on everything we've heard and throughout like the presentations of the day or these tech demos we saw. Or it could be a business planning design thinking workshop where we say, okay, given our different groups, what are our goals? Like, let's articulate those. What is going well for us in pursuit of those goals? What internal challenges are we facing? What external blockers are keeping us from reaching those goals? And the differentiation between those two is like, what are the things we can control and what are the things we can't? And then we get into like initiative definition. And this can be, given the goals and the problems we've identified, what is the value of reaching those goals or mitigating those problem areas? What does doing that look like? What is the actual like solution to this small problem as a small component of a larger problem we're trying to solve? And then how do we prioritize those initiatives? And then how do we plan out who needs to do what at what time? So that's like a more business oriented workshop, but then we can get into a workshop for solution design. And this looks more kind of like the process I went through earlier, articulating what the problem for a particular user we want to build a solution for is. So, and that can be through multiple different activities, and empathy map is one activity. It could be through stakeholder mapping, understanding like what is the landscape of the problem area we're trying to solve. And this helps us understand like what are the different priorities we need to focus on in the solution we're building.
The way that you run the workshops, like, do you do that with text essentially, like sticky notes, or are images involved? Like, what is the medium that you usually do?
Yeah, usually it's sticky notes. And in a, I guess, broader approach sense, the way we go through it, and the way IBM kind of defines design thinking is not through the typical waterfall method you'll see, which is define, design, develop, deliver. We have like a constant approach, which is a constant observation of what's going on in the current, a reflection on that current state, and making something out of it. So if there's a problem, we observe it and we say, these are our observations, and we write one on a sticky note. And then this all happens individually. And then together we put these sticky notes up on the wall. Then we reflect on it as a group, and we say, okay, these thematically go together, and we'll cluster them and group them together and say, okay, these are these aspects of the problem. It's kind of like, building a mental model of a problem. And then given the observations we make and the reflections we as a group come together, and rally around when viewing that problem as a group, we then make something, and that can be anything as small as like an idea or a goal, or it could be as big as a prototype or an actual like full-fledged product definition. And this kind of happens in a fractal sense. It's like it could happen at the individual level, or it could happen at like the full project level.
Do you ever do like, I don't know, prototyping, rapid prototyping as part of the workshops, or usually that would come later?
Sometimes, if there are tools we have that could rapidly prototype a component of a solution idea that we have, then especially like because prompt engineering is kind of so easy. Prompt engineers might hate me for saying that, but like, I mean, if we like, for example, if we're building a generative AI solution and it's using an LLM, and we come up with an idea in a workshop around, okay, this like, what if we have an LLM generate JSON in the like meant for this particular user to solve this particular problem? We may whip up like a prompt that like builds that out within a workshop, and we may test how it works, and then we may like iterate on what our solution is depending on how successful that is.
What about I don't know, using Figma to create, I don't know, product flows, or is the work that you do typically with like LLMs?
No, well, I wouldn't say the work I typically do is with LLMs, but I also wouldn't say we typically do Figma prototyping unless it's just really quick, rapid prototyping of like low fidelity interfaces. But even then, a lot of the workshops I run aren't at the prototyping phase yet. A lot of the workshops I run are around the actual conceptualization phase.
More like discovery?
Yeah. So if we come up now, say we come up with a concept, especially around a problem, a big like next step after you come up with a solution concept is to scope it down. And this is where prototyping kind of comes in. And this is where we say, okay, let's prioritize the different components of what this solution looks like based on the problems we're trying to solve and what we are personally capable of. And this is where we actually start like prototyping what that solution looks like.
Got it. Do you personally get involved with prototyping or not, like with the visual prototyping, I guess, or not
Sometimes I
really?
do. Not as often these days. That is more on the longer term projects I'm working on outside of this workshop based work. So with the research project or with the projects I've done with research, a lot of that has been more long term, where we will build interfaces as a means of gathering data. And so this is where like not design research, but research design comes in, where we have a hypothesis around what a solution might provide based on the technology we have and the problems we're trying to solve. We'll build out a novel solution, and then we'll build out an interface for that solution and test it out with users in order to determine whether or not this is a generalizable solution across different like forms of this very like base human problem.
Yeah. So at IBM, you guys have kind of a standardized definitions for like framework for design thinking, and it comes with a certain set of specific standards, terms, and definitions, like, you know, hills, for example. I'm not as familiar with every little detail, but I think you know, there is a definition, like the hill is basically kind of a user story, almost, like, I don't know how
Kind
to
of, yeah.
do you use that standard kind of standardized language, so to speak, and terminology when you run the workshops, or not
Oh yeah.
necessarily? Yeah.
Oh yeah. And it's useful because like, I mean, kind of going back to the definition of design thinking, and the reason we take an approach oriented definition as opposed to a process oriented definition is because the actual like tools that are used, like hills, like empathy maps, like business landscaping, these have a standardized name for each of these, but they are just tools. You're not going to use a hill in every design thinking workshop because it doesn't solve every problem we might be trying to solve in design thinking. a hill is really good for getting that kind of, I guess, agreed upon group understanding of what a solution needs to be. For listeners who may not be aware, a hill is derived of three components. One is a who, one is a what, and one is a wow. The who is like, who are we building for? The what is, what are we enabling them to do? And the wow is, what makes this enablement different from what they already have access to today? So, and this is meant to be kind of a general statement of intent rather than a solution definition. It's meant as a form of getting people aligned on, okay, this is, they call it a hill because I think it was like General Paxton who said he informs his troops to go take that hill. He doesn't say how or what they need to do to take that hill. He doesn't micromanage it. He just says, our goal is to go take that hill. And so this is kind of meant as a statement to say, this is what we're building, go build it. We trust you in all of your brains and all of your smart and skills and these, and like your team work abilities to go and make this experience. It's for this person. This is what you're enabling them to do. And this is the differentiator for this enablement.
That's cool. I didn't know the story behind it. Yeah, that makes sense. Because I mean, would you say it's similar, or like, what would you say it's similar to? Like in my mind, it's kind of like, I mean, jobs to be done definition is somewhat similar. Like who, what, wow. Like I as a user need to because of that.
So it's different from, so we kind of call like the latter of what you said a needs statement, and that is more around a particular person. And then, but they are similar to hills in a sense, but they provide, I guess, a different value. And then jobs to be done are more of an internal tool we use for saying, okay, like if there are different levels to this, the hill is kind of at the top, and the hill is like, this is what we're making, like the base like level of what we're making. Then the need statements inform that hill. These are like, this is, if we're considering the who aspect of the hill, then the need statements are like, this person has this need so that they can do this, and this provides the reasoning behind why this person is involved in the hill. And then jobs to be done are like the actual thought process or reaction to, like, if we're observing the hill, we're reflecting on what are the things we need to do in order to make that hill a reality, and then the jobs to be done are what we've made in order to achieve that goal.
So basically, a hill would be at a higher level, and you could still use jobs to be done, like in conjunction with that, to essentially at the more granular level.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. When you run the workshops, like when you facilitate them, do you try to take your personal opinion kind of out of it, or do you actually express it and state it and make it part of the process?
Mostly the former, sometimes the latter. And I think it's because as a facilitator, your job isn't to be the person actually designing the solution. You're kind of conducting the participants in the workshop to design the solution. You, in a lot of the time, what you're doing as a facilitator is seeing like the rabbit holes people are going down, or you're honing in on like the how people are approaching solving a problem. And where your opinion comes in is like, okay, is this actually the right direction or not? And you say where your opinion comes in is like, okay, I think we're focusing a little too much on this aspect of the problem. Let's focus a bit more on like, let's break outside the box a little. I or let's think about it from this different perspective. Or especially around like when you have people in your workshop that are a bit louder or a bit more like controlling of the room than certain people are. It's your job as a facilitator to say like, hey, we've heard a lot from you. What about like point to like someone who maybe hasn't spoken up very much. Like, what do you think about all this? So it's kind of like you are conducting the room, and that is a form of like design, because you are like still kind of at the head of like something that is being made, and like it's almost like the people are your, I guess, tool set for. And I don't like to view it that way, because I don't view people as like tools, but it's like they have their own, like, it's a collaborative process where you bring people together, and like through their different perspectives, you're able to kind of look over it all and like have a particular output that the group comes together to build.
Is it important to like ensure that the group is comprised of like a certain type of people to then kind of consider it a successful outcome? Like, for example, if you have only a certain subset represented,
Mhm.
but it doesn't cover kind of the whole story, then technically that could lead to like incomplete result, and then you bring it back to the wider group and they're like, well, this is shit. So like, do you kind of plan that as part of the workshop to like making sure that different diverse opinions are represented?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big role of the design, of the like facilitator, the designer at the
Mm-hmm.
head of it, is to like make sure that there are no like dominant voices. And to an extent, this can be, I mean, this can be really difficult to do, because a lot of the time you may just have a group coming in and say, this is everyone who is available. Um, and you have, like, you just have your people you need to work with. And if that's the case, then it's also your job to say, okay, let's consider who outside of this group we need to, consider. And let's make sure that it is known among the whole group that our perspective as a group is limited, because we're not considering these perspectives.
Yeah.
And that leads to like next steps. Like if you have a generalized idea of like what your output is at the end of a workshop, and you have an understanding of where the gaps in how you reach that end artifact, if you have an understanding of what those gaps are, then you can then say, okay, after this workshop, it's really important that we go and talk to this subset of people, these coworkers, these users we didn't include, and validate a lot of the assumptions we made. Because again, these are all like, at the end of the day, assumptions. They're bets we're making in the business.
Is it typical during the workshop to use, I don't know, supporting data, quantitative data, or other types of data to sort of present that to the group so that they use that? Or it's more about getting the, intuition and opinions of the group without external inputs?
To an extent, yes, but in and this is why follow up to workshops is so important, and why it's also important to like not promise a full-fledged product at the end of a workshop, because we can validate the assumptions we make in a workshop through those more concrete, uh, validated, like quantitative, qualitative data collection methods. But and this kind of goes back to the point where like we're using people's informed opinion throughout the workshop, and a lot of the time that they may be informed or they may be misinformed, but when you have a group of people in the workshop, it's ideal to trust what they are saying, and trust that they have reason for saying what they are saying. And having multiple people who are informed about their background around the problem that we're tackling, um, having like multiple different perspectives in that single group is really important, because then you can start to understand where the miscommunications are, or where the misunderstandings are, by comparing what certain people are saying versus other people.
Right.
If we're focusing on one problem and two people say completely different things about their understanding of that problem, that means one of them is probably misinformed. And then you can get into a quick discussion around, okay, what is the actual like truth?
Mm-hmm. What excites you these days, like as far as, at work? What are some of the exciting problems or challenges, or I don't know, can be tools? Like what's been lately on your radar that you're like, wow, this is I'm loving this. Like I really want to work on this. Um,
Yeah, I think like, you know, I I'm like kind of just very recently going through this like phase of where I'm like, okay, do I really want to stay in AI? Um, because I feel like it has been really exciting to try and like understand what are the problems we're seeing in the usage of AI. Um, and I think it's been really illuminating into the limitations of it. Um, but at the same time, what's really been exciting me at work in particular has been gaining an understanding of what are the effects of AI usage on humans in the long term. So if we consider like how people use generative AI or how they like dream about using generative AI. A
What what
few
have what have been the effects of long-term usage?
so I know there's some research that came out recently from Microsoft that covers I think how using large language models apparently I haven't read through the paper yet, but apparently it's showing signs of like cognitive decline or like less rigorous critical thinking when we're
Mm.
using large language models to think through problems. But I also have read some like discussion around that saying that that's not actually what the paper is saying. So I think there's still a bit to be done there. But particularly where I'm interested, what I'm interested in is when we are relying on AI or automation tools in general or technology in general to do certain things that humans are kind of like meant to do from in like it may be controversial to say like from a nature perspective, but um like what is the long-term effect that has on us? Like even when I think about there's that famous quote, um like I don't want AI to do my art for me. I want it to fold my socks and do my
Yeah.
dishes so that I can do art. And even that quote I kind of have a problem with because how essential are those menial tasks of doing dishes and folding clothes to to the human experience? Um, I read a discussion from a colleague of mine, Chris Nozzle. He he's been working on really interesting ideas around like the effects of AI usage on people for like years. There was a discussion I saw he had on LinkedIn recently that I thought was really interesting, and there was one quote from that really stuck with me, and it's like, how many of us have silently mourned the death of a loved one while folding socks? And when we think about these like menial things that people do, it's like, what is the effect of having like every easy thing done for us? Um, what
Mm.
experience do we have to derive our artistic intent from if we don't have hardships to build art from, or if we don't do work anymore, or if we don't do work anymore, if we don't do little silly human tasks, what does that do to us in the long term?
The metaphor that I'm getting almost like is that it's kind of getting too much sugar, like kind of that it's essentially if you take out the mundane, you're left with extracted, you know, most exciting or most difficult, that it almost becomes potentially too exhausting because those kind of mundane things could serve as uh, points of, you know, where you can take a breather, do something, right?
Yeah, I think like in a I guess more practical example, when we think about like creative practice, when we so I was talking to a friend of mine who is he's a monster concept designer, and he's saying a lot of what how AI is being used in his field today is it'll come up with like the base image for a concept designer to draw on top of, so it kind of like guides the general structure. And we use tools like this a lot. Before AI, we've used those wooden guys that we can like put into different
Hmm.
poses to have a quick reference for yeah like what
Figure drawing, yeah. Hmm.
yeah for figure drawing. And but when it starts to get more I guess higher fidelity, and we start just tracing on top of like base level monster concepts, then we like, does the artist start to lose the process of like coming up with those like very base level concepts that they can then build on top of into those higher fidelities? If we
Yeah.
have an AI automate our UI design, or like automate components based off of a base level like idea we have, then we're kind of like giving up that agency to this generalized abstraction of what a component looks like. And we're no longer thinking through, we're just, we're no longer thinking through the problem. We're saying this is the solution to the problem because this has always been the solution to the problem. And the
Yeah,
AI
yeah.
reinforces that.
Yeah, it's crazy also that whatever that paper says is that, I mean, AI hasn't even been that long in the general population, like for, ChatGPT and whatnot, which I think this is what started the large use by kind of mainstream. So to start to observe some sort of decline, cognitive decline or decline in critical thinking over such a short time. I don't know, like, what do you know what was the timeline?
No, I don't know.
Because
I
that
I
is
do need to read that paper.
that's kind of that's crazy. I can, like, in with people like in this kind of in this series, part of what I do explore is the impact of AI on craft and the industry. And I haven't talked to that many people yet, but I think that the theme is that people tend to say that like AI is great and all of that, but it's important to know how to recreate whatever it is on your own. The barrier for entry is decreasing. It's a lot easier to start doing, coding or designing or whatever today than 20 years ago or 15 or whatever amount of time. But if people will miss and not learn how to actually be able to perform those things, then that may have an impact on the growth. It's almost like when I was taking music lessons also, like for electronic music, and I remember asking my teacher like, hey, is that okay to use samples like of drums loops or guitar loops? Because to me it was like, well, I'm kind of cheating, or right, like I put these things together and it sounds nice. And he was like, yeah, absolutely, I mean, that's fine, because I mean, technically you could just go in and repeat it on your own. It's about time saving. And I was like thinking to myself, well, I'm sure you can being a professional musician, to like replicate those drums or guitar loops or whatever. I know that I can't. So I think you still need to be able to replicate it. On the other hand, like for example, for someone like myself, I used to code like 20 years ago. I'm interested to try again. I know that I'm not going to go and become like a very thorough engineer, but AI could help me to articulate and make concepts. So it's interesting. It's a double edged, yeah. But I'm not also planning to be an engineer,
Right.
right? Um,
And I think this is a really interesting like problem space to think about. At the end of the day, it's about what you care about. And if you care about craft, then a lot of the time what that really means is going down into the nuances of what it is, what it takes to like build up the artifact that you're trying to build. And so for an engineer, that's really understanding the code behind like the code base. For a designer, it's really understanding the theory and the both from the like visual design perspective and the more like cognitive oriented user experience design perspective of like what builds up the final design. For a jazz musician, that could be like their understanding of music theory. For a painter, it could be the different techniques of like the brush strokes they use. But then like what is your goal behind what it is you're trying to make? Let's say you're a musician. Do you care about having the skill uh to be able to produce drum beats on your own? Do you have do you care that like what you're building has like, or do you care about having the ability to like keep in time? or do you care about like producing the final song? And this is also like kind of the crux of any creative practice in general, is that kind of interplay between experimental, like working on your craft, and free play, and like getting toward that like final artifact you want to build. Are these just tools at your disposal to build that final artifact, or do you care about the process of like what goes into building that final artifact?
Yeah, maybe it's about a personal choice. Whatever is the core skill set, the domain, then yeah, like need to learn it deeply. And maybe AI is sort of this bridge to help you connect to different like cross disciplinary fields more easily, but you're not necessarily going to be considering yourself, that like I'm not going to consider myself an engineer if I do some prototypes, with cursor and some tools like that's right.
And the danger there is when you present yourself as someone, as an expert engineer, because you relied on AI to build the actual prototype that you conceptualized. And this is where, like, if you hand off that code to a real like engineer, they may say like, why did you make these choices? And you're not going to be able to explain why. But if you, and this is I think that this is also how I like use cursor. It's not as a means to build a final product. It's used as a means to test an idea,
Mm-hmm.
to prototype something. And it's, if I were to hand it off to an engineer, I would say like, hey, this was made with AI. I'm not an engineer. It may be like kind of shitty code. And it's all about like, who do you want to be and who do you present yourself as in any creative practice?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's good. So you mentioned that you're thinking and kind of questioning whether you want to stay in AI because you have sort of concerns about its effect on society, or
Mostly because, I don't even know if it's about my concern about the effect AI will have on society. It's going to have an effect on society, like, and that's out of my hands.
yeah.
um, but it's more around like, what do I genuinely think it's more around like, what do I value in my own design career, or I guess career in general. I think I'm like being pulled into having more interest around like generalized design, exploring different design practices. And I think like working in AI was really exciting for a while, because we did have to kind of, while the general design process kind of stays the same, we needed to consider new components. And I think generally I like working in emergent technology, um, and I've done a lot of work in AI, and I guess building ideas and frameworks and methods and mental models around how do we design for AI. Um, and now I'm kind of interested in what are other methods of design for other, like, not even just emergent technologies, but kind of going back to like design fiction and speculative futures. This is a really interesting way of like articulating future intent, or articulating design decisions, is this practice of design fiction, and future forecasting, and speculative design. I think there's a lot of interesting, fun things to be had in this space, because it's not as well explored as these more traditional areas of design. I just had a really interesting conversation with this group in Berlin called Normals. I think they call themselves like a future factory, and the way they run workshops is by acknowledging the fact that we have different generalized, societally fueled ideas of what the future looks like. We have multiple different ideas of what the future looks like. Some of them are more doom and gloom. Some of them are more like um, uh, cyberpunk. Some of them are like Afropunk. Some of them can be uh, what's it called? Solar punk, I think, is another, like, lots of punks. But uh, by taking these archetypes of the future and building an idea of like, why do we as a society think that the future looks like this, kind of interrogating that a little bit, and then helping us better understand like what the signals that are leading up to these different future archetypes and building something new out of that and addressing how we approach our business and our design decisions today based off our understanding of what the future looks like or what multiple different futures could look like. It's hard to articulate, but it is a really interesting way to look at how we currently look at building and designing and the reasons behind why we design today.
And you think that it would not involve AI?
Well, I mean, I think it will definitely involves AI to some extent, but I also think it's beyond AI. It's about like how we as humans interact with technology and each other in general. Like a solution that uses AI should use AI for a good reason, and it should also be beneficial to the human condition. And so, I think when we think about whether or not we use AI, that's just a small decision within the larger scope of what design is.
What do you think is like the future of generative AI from your perspective?
I see a lot of unnecessary products being made, and a lot of unnecessary products failing, with a few that stick around because they are useful. I kind of think in the more practical sense, things like predicting weather, predicting how forest fires spread, how proteins are built. I think AlphaFold is a really like genuinely useful use of generative AI.
On your website, you have some really cool tools that you built for helping to kind of start the project, generate ideas, understand, customer needs.
This was actually one of my first like experiments, or I guess tests into human AI co-creativity.
We can maybe take a quick look at one of them. Do you have a favorite one of these three?
So I'm actually cringing a little looking back at some of these because these are straight up like generating artifacts that humans should be generating. But because the need statements, people should be saying what they need. But I mean, this was also built with the intent of saying we should validate the assumptions that are.
I think it's implicit that you would not be just taking it as is. But I think that it's kind of a good starting point almost, right? And like, for example, describe the user we're facing and the situation they're in. So, I don't know, a patient at medical office waiting for a doctor. I don't know. Provide any additional information you'd like about the user, such as your empathy map or any pain points. So, I don't know, they need to get home soon. I have not tested this one. But so you submit, and then it's going to give you assumed pain points, uncertainty about how long the wait will be, anxiety about missing appointments, difficulty in managing time effectively. Do something that addresses their need, provide real-time updates on wait times, offer a way to reschedule or prioritize appointments, implement a communication system that alerts patients when it's their turn. The benefits: reduces stress, helps patients manage their day more effectively. Like, actually, this is pretty good, like first run outputs, right? How did you build like, what is behind it? Is that basically like a prompt that just helps to generate kind of a concise list?
Yeah. We've talked a lot about like design thinking and how we approach it today. This is built out of a prompting framework I created that was actually working with research. It was the first research paper I've been able to publish. It was at a workshop at Kai in 2023, and it was a really cool experience being able to do that. But what I did was come up with a prompting framework that through a subset of 5 different sub prompts, like it creates one single large prompt that gives the generative AI enough context and enough instruction to build artifacts as one would through design thinking. So, for example, it instructs the model around what the process of going through a design thinking exercise looks like. So in the case of need statements, it's assuming or deriving from the data what the pain points to solve are, how the user could benefit, and through that, assuming or building an idea of what the actual need statement is. And this is done through both static prompts that focus more on like, how do we articulate what a need statement is and how do we build one pragmatically or systematically? And then two variable subprompts, which focus on the context surrounding why we're doing the activity in the first place. So in this case, the variable subprompts are those inputs you put in, and whether or not it needs to just go through the whole exercise at once or ask follow-up questions or go through each step one by one. So when you put in the variables surrounding the problem you're trying to solve, that kind of completes the prompt, and now it knows the process it needs to go through and how it generates its final artifacts, which are like the sticky notes or like the pieces of text that are generated.
Is there like a language model that is specific to this?
I use ChatGPT for this one, but the prompt model itself is generalizable, and you can actually read the paper on my website as well. And the paper has an example in there as well, but it outlines what the full prompt looks like.
I was going to share really quick for the folks to go and check out Brandon's website, design, and I think you have a really cool site with a
thank you.
chatbot and experiments. And one thing that actually, I don't know if you know, but so in your title here, like seeing, speaking to, and solving very human problems in an increasingly less than human landscape. So my studio that I used to run out of San Francisco that I'm not actively as involved in with that right now, but it's called Still Human. And and I titled that like a while ago. AI was not really happening as much at that time, and I think that like, yeah, it still very much resonates with me. I can sense sense where you're going with that from the statement. To your point about staying with AI or not. I mean, I feel like the more people who actually care deeply about the impacts, on humans, have empathy. I think we and everybody should continue to stay and do the work. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for sharing. Is there, besides your website, where can folks go to find more information about you? I don't know. Do you post on X or?
Yeah, I've really been trying to take a step back from social media lately, and maybe that's to my detriment professionally. But I am on LinkedIn. Please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn if you want to talk about anything with me. And you can read my latest article on Medium, and which there's a link to that on my LinkedIn. I always love talking to people and making new human connections.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I had a wonderful time.